Hello, my name is Mick Fowler and I'm talking about the first ascent of the Prow of Shiva in the Pangi Valley area of the Indian Himalaya. This is one of the IMF webinar series, so thank you very much to the Indian Mountaineering Foundation for hosting it. A little bit about me to begin with. I've been climbing in the greater ranges since 1982, doing first ascents throughout the world, really, approximately 10 expeditions to the Indian Himalaya, and I'm an ex-president of the Alpine Club. Now, Shiva is, as I mentioned, in the Pangi Valley area, near Lahul of the Indian Himalaya, and for people like me from the UK, the quickest way to get there is to fly to Delhi, then get the overnight bus from Delhi to Manali, and from Manali we hired a minibus for the 16-hour journey over the Rohtang Pass, down the Chenab Valley, and eventually turning off into the Sichuan Valley. We managed to drive as far as the end of the red line, and then the green line is the 2 days that we spent walking into a base camp under the east face of Shiva. Now, Shiva came about as an objective when I saw a tiny photograph in the American Alpine Journal, and the right-hand skyline of that photograph made me think that one day that would become my objective for the year. So Paul Ramsden and I decided that this was something that we both wanted to do. We spent about a year perhaps gathering information, trying to arrange some sponsorship, and we're looking forward very much to going. We contacted a Russian team who'd been to the west side of Shiva, and just about a couple of weeks before we were due to go, they shared this photograph of the Prow of Shiva from the west side, which we'd not seen before. It made it look horrendously steep and difficult, and Andrei Murishev, the man who shared the information with us, commented, "Frankly, I cannot imagine how you will do it," which was not quite what we wanted to hear just before we were leaving the UK. So we always climb as teams of two. Sometimes there are 4 of us on a trip and we climb as 2 completely separate teams of 2, which was the occasion on Shiva. So there was me on the right there, climbing with Paul Ramsden in the Berghaus t-shirt, who's my regular climbing partner at the time. And then further left is Ian Cartwright and Steve Burns, who are regular climbers on the UK evening climbing scene. And of course, we're joined by our Indian team, which is Rinku on the left there, our great liaison officer, Devraj, our kitchen boy, and Pritam, our cook. All 3 of them were star chaps and helped to make it a really successful trip. So there were 7 of us all together. We met up in Manali and boarded a minibus to cross the Rohtang Pass at about 4,000 meters here and drop down the other side. Always feel that you're entering the Himalaya proper when you drop down the north side of the Rohtang Pass into the upper Chenab Valley. And then 16 hours of driving from Manali, we turned up the Sichuan Valley, and finally our trusty vehicle could go no further. And well, we were rather shocked actually when our driver most impressively decided that he would turn around at this point where the road ended, which took him a very long time indeed. Anyway, from here, we had to transfer to mules for the final 2 days of walking to base camp. And it's an absolutely idyllic walk. Very few people in this part of the Indian Himalaya. Is well away from the normal trekking routes, and very few through routes in these particular valleys. So we're walking here past the village of Tuan, and the plan was that it would take 2 days with our mules to walk up to base camp. But after day 1, the mules couldn't go any further. The vegetation was very dense, and we had to carry the loads ourselves with the assistance of some porters up to our base camp. So we had a base camp at about 3,800, 3,900 meters below the east face of Shiva. There was only one team that we were aware of that had been up this valley before, and that was an Italian team led by Bruno Moretti, who had attempted Shiva Shankar, or Sursank, the mountain at the head of the valley there. I mentioned earlier there's not many trekkers in this part of the world. This particular valley is a cul-de-sac. There's no pass at the top that leads anywhere. So there's no real incentive for trekkers to come up here. And that means that there are, in these valleys, these cul-de-sac valleys, there are sort of hidden, unclimbed gems, of which Shiva is a good example. So Shiva was extremely visible. I might almost have said too visible from our base camp. And we could see how very steep the upper part of the pillar was. And we were not at all sure that we were good enough to be able to climb it. But certainly before we even could get into a position where we would attempt the very steep ground, we had to get up a very broken glacier at the bottom and then up a mixed face to gain the North Ridge below the North Buttress, the Prow. And the glacier was pretty broken up, and we crossed this 3 times, once to gain some height and to a reconnaissance when we were acclimatizing, and then descending from that outing. And then we went up again, of course, when we actually did the climb. And 3 times was quite enough for me, thanks very much, in this kind of terrain. Now, to get up to the crest of the North Ridge below the steepest part of the buttress, we knew we would be climbing an east face, which would catch the sun first thing in the morning. And so we left our tent on the glacier, our camp on the glacier. We left at about midnight, climbed right the way through the night, and reached the knife edge crest at about 8 o'clock in the morning. The last couple of hundred foot to the crest were really hot, and we were very glad indeed that we started out right in the middle of the night. We'd always intended to bivouac as soon as we reached the crest, so we chopped off the crest. It was a very soft crest, pitched our little tent, and looking up, we could see the very steep buttress above us. Well, we'd always known that the rock was likely to be very poor. Bruno Moretti had warned us of that, and other people who'd been climbing in that part of the world had warned us that the rock might be very bad. But what we found was that although the lower section was a sort of loose, insecure shale, this upper section, as soon as you got onto the very steep ground, it turned into perfect quality granite. And for us, the challenge was not so much loose rock or objective dangers, but simply whether or not we would be good enough to climb it. And I think a word about ethics at this point, because of course it's possible to climb anything if you cheat, basically, use bolts, I would say. Paul and I, we use natural features of the mountain to make progress. So here is the only section on the route, actually, that we used some direct aid, where Paul has got some camming devices that are wedged in the cracks and is standing on slings to overcome this section. But we take the view that items of equipment that use natural features in the rock are acceptable, but bolts are something completely different, because with a bolt, you can overcome a completely blank section, and you're just not using the features of the rock at all. So when we reached this particularly blank slab, very low down on the buttress, we thought that we might well be failing at this point. It looked such a smooth slab. There were no obvious lines of weakness in it at all. And we were just very, very fortunate that Paul, who was leading here, managed to unearth a crack system that he was able to climb and get back out up onto the crest of the buttress. And certainly, if we hadn't had the good fortune to find that crack system, we would have failed, because I think to use bolts to overcome blank obstacles like this is a complete no-no. And to enlarge on that, really, I think some people do use bolts in that situation, and I think it's absolutely cheating. We should be humble enough to leave as challenges for future generations to climb properly. For us, overcoming that section didn't make life much easier. The more difficult climbing was higher up on the buttress. But we were very, very fortunate that the climbing conditions were absolutely perfect. The snow and ice was just the right consistency. We were able to get reasonable ice axe placements, pull up on the ice axes, firm snow for the crampons, not too much snow on the surrounding rock, which was of really good quality. And because there was not so much snow on it, you could see the cracks quite easily to place good, solid, secure protection. But even so, there were many pitches where we were very unsure about whether we would be good enough to climb them. And pitch after pitch, we'd look up and say, well, not quite sure if we can do this, but we'll give it a go. We had an idea of where we were going, because Paul had a good pair of binoculars on the acclimatization outing, and he had studied the route in detail with these binoculars, and he had drawn a little topo, and even with places where we might spend the night on the route. And that meant that we were actually able to sniff out reasonable ice patches to cut ledges on for the nights that we're on the steepest part of the buttress. And we were able to get our centre of gravity over the ledges so we could actually lie down to a certain extent. And we carry a small tent, a 2-man tent, that one person can use as a bivouac bag, and then we carry a purpose-made bivouac bag that the other person can use in those circumstances. And we were very lucky. We were sponsored by Berghaus for this trip, and modern Berghaus equipment is really high quality, so we're super warm and cozy overnight, and it's really not too bad to spend nights out in this kind of situation where, when you look at a photograph like this, you might think that looks awful, but it's really not too bad at all. Now, the upper part of the route, it became more difficult to place protection. There was a lot more ice at the back, in the back of the cracks, and several pitches like this, where they're increasingly steep, awkward pitches, very smooth rock, and the only protection was ice screws in the narrow ice streaks up the back of the corner. But you'll see there the leader, that's me in this pic, is leading with his rucksack on. And that's something that we always try and do. That both of us like to climb every pitch on the route, as opposed to jumaring up ropes or anything like that. So the leader will climb with his sack on, the second will climb with his sack on, and we will climb alternate leads. If a particularly hard pitch comes up, like this one that Paul's doing, the leader will take their sack off and haul the sack up afterwards. But that is inconvenient because it means that the leader has 2 ropes. He can only clip the protection into one rope and haul up the rucksack on the other rope. The rucksack gets stuck. It has to be manhandled by the second person. And it's all a bit of a faff. So we very much prefer to have the leader carry his rucksack on his back if at all possible. Now, if you see this orange overhang at the top here, in the next photograph is the orange overhang just here. And our plan from there was to follow these ice streaks up and then up and out leftwards to eventually exit onto the ridge here. But in fact, we got to this point and couldn't get up, or couldn't easily get up these overhangs here. And we ended up in rather bad weather, being forced rightwards along this band of snow. And in bad weather in the evening, we couldn't get round the corner there. It's much steeper and more difficult than it looks. And we ended up retreating to pitch our little tent at this point here, which was the end of our 6th day out from base camp. 3 days up to the base of the real steep section, and 3 days up to this bivouac point below this chimney here, cleaving this very steep rock wall, which looked to be the only possible way that we could make it up to the summit. And it's amazing when we look at the photograph of that bivouac now, it just looks so uncomfortable. There was a very, very bad weather in the night as well. But once you're inside the tent and you've been able to put the poles up, so you have your own space inside the fabric, able to cook inside the tent, it's amazing what a difference it makes. And Paul and I both had a pretty comfortable night here. And so in the morning, we were well rested and ready to go when the good weather returned, and out we could get. The final pitch, that's me leading this chimney pitch. I did have to take my rucksack off and haul it up, which was a bit of a faff. But looking up, I remember squeezing through the narrow section at the very top there and pulling out and belaying as Paul came up and looking out. And I can remember our conversation on saying how fortunate we felt we were to be able to climb such a wonderful route in such a glorious part of the world, and actually see panoramic mountain views like this. That's the Kishtwar Himalaya on the left, going round to Pangi and Lahul. Just many, many, many beautiful mountains. And looking up, it's really not very far ahead on our 7th day. we could break through the cornice and stand on the summit of Shiva, which felt very, very special after 7 days or 6.5 days of effort from base camp. To actually break through and stand on the summit was a very special moment. Shiva itself had been climbed before, and been climbed from the south a couple of times, 3 or 4 times, I think. But Paul and I, we always like to descend a different route than the way we've climbed up, if possible. And this, if that route is unclimbed, so much the better. So we're able to descend this south ridge here to the lowest point on the ridge, and then drop down across these glacier systems here, over this col, and back down here to our base camp. The ridge itself was not particularly difficult, but it did get the sun in the afternoon, or the face got the sun in the afternoon. So it took us 2 days to get down the ridge, back down to base camp, which was the end of a 9-day round trip from base camp. And then, because we're both on a limited time from our jobs, it was get back to the office as quickly as possible, get changed from the happy alpinist to the rather more stern administrator back in the office in the UK. And dream of what for both of us, I think, had been one of the most enjoyable climbs that we'd ever done. It was a very obvious line going straight to the summit of the mountain. It was objectively safe. The weather was mainly good. It was testing, challenging climbing. We did exactly what we'd set out to do, even though we were unsure whether we'd be good enough to do it, and we managed to come down a different way. So all in all, it was one of the most enjoyable trips that I've ever done, certainly. So it just remains for me to say thank you to the IMF for putting this chat on their webinar series. And secondly, of course, to you for coming along and watching. Thank you very much indeed.